What if everything you were taught about the beginning of civilization is wrong? Not incomplete, not slightly inaccurate, but fundamentally wrong? What if the first advanced civilization on Earth didn't collapse, didn't get wiped out by war, disease, or natural disaster, but made a choice, a deliberate, calculated decision to leave, not to migrate, not to disappear into history, but to abandon the planet itself? And what if the only things they left behind were fragments, stone structures, distorted myths, and whispers encoded into the oldest stories humanity has ever told? Before you dismiss this as fiction, ask yourself one simple question. Why do ancient cultures, separated by oceans and thousands of years, all tell the same story about beings who came from the sky, taught humanity everything, and then returned to the stars? If this kind of exploration resonates with you, take a moment now. Subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment with where you're watching from. It helps more than you think, and it keeps these journeys going. Now, let's begin. According to conventional history, civilization begins roughly 6,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. The Sumerians, the first cities, the first writing, the first structured societies. Before that, we're told, there were only scattered tribes, hunters and gatherers slowly learning how to farm, how to settle, how to build. It's a clean, linear progression, simple to complex, primitive to advanced, generation by generation. But there's a problem with that story, because scattered across the planet are anomalies, structures and discoveries that don't fit. Not just slightly out of place, but completely incompatible with that timeline. And one of the most unsettling of them all was uncovered in southeastern Turkey. In 1963, a farmer noticed a strange stone protruding from his field. At first, it seemed insignificant, just another rock. But decades later, when archaeologists finally examined the site, they uncovered something that shouldn't exist according to everything we thought we knew. Gobleki Tepe, a massive, carefully designed architectural complex built around 12,000 years ago. Let that sink in. 12,000. That's more than 6,000 years before the Sumerians. More than 7,000 years before the pyramids of Egypt. This structure was already ancient, before what we call civilization had even begun. And yet, it is not primitive. Towering T-shaped pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons. Intricate carvings of animals, executed with precision and artistic detail that rivals much later cultures. A layout that suggests planning, organization, intention. This was not sluchinist. This was engineering. But here's the contradiction. At the time Göbekli Tepe was built, there were supposedly no cities, no organized societies, no metal tools, no wheel, no domesticated animals to transport massive stones. According to the accepted model, the people of that era should not have been capable of building anything like this. And yet, they did. So historians adapted, not the model, but the explanation. They suggested that maybe hunter-gatherers were more advanced than we thought, that maybe they somehow coordinated large-scale construction projects without the basic tools we consider essential. But that explanation creates more questions than answers, because if that level of capability existed, where else is it? Why don't we see similar structures everywhere from that time period? Why is Göbekli Tepe so isolated, so singular, and perhaps the most unsettling detail of all? Around 10,000 years ago, the entire complex was deliberately buried, not destroyed, not abandoned and left to decay. Buried. Carefully. Intentionally. As if someone wanted to preserve it, or hide it, or protect it from something. That single decision changes everything, because civilizations don't usually erase their greatest achievements. They build on them, expand them, celebrate them, unless they know something is coming, which leads us to a possibility that is difficult to ignore. What if Gobleki Tepe is not the beginning of civilization, but the end of one? What if it is not a first attempt, but a final message? A marker, a signal, a preserved fragment left behind by a civilization that was already leaving, already preparing to disappear from this planet entirely. And if that's true, then Gobleki Tepe is not alone. Because once you start looking, you begin to see the same pattern everywhere. Because Gobleki Tepe is not an isolated mystery. It is a pattern. And like all patterns, once you recognize it, it becomes impossible to unsee. Thousands of kilometers away, on the Giza Plateau in Egypt, stand the most famous structures on Earth, the pyramids. You've seen them countless times. You've heard the explanation. Tombs for pharaohs, built around 4,500 years ago using primitive tools and sheer manpower. But when you slow down and actually examine the details, that explanation begins to fracture. The Great Pyramid of Giza contains roughly 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing, on average, 2.5 tons. Some far heavier, reaching up to 50, even 80 tons. According to the standard timeline, it was built in about 20 years. Do the math. That would require placing one massive stone every 2 minutes, continuously, day and night, for 2 decades without pause. No modern machinery, no steel tools, no cranes, no engines, just copper chisels, wooden sleds, and human labor. Even with today's technology, replicating the precision of the Great Pyramid is a serious challenge. Its base is almost perfectly level across more than 230 meters. Its alignment with the cardinal directions is nearly flawless. The margin of error is so small, it's difficult to explain even now. And then there are the numbers. The ratio between the pyramid's perimeter and its height closely matches a mathematical constant, picotorf, accurate to multiple decimal places. Coincidence, perhaps. But the coincidences don't stop there. The pyramid sits in a location that corresponds almost exactly to the geographical center of Earth's landmass. To determine that, you would need a global understanding of the planet, its shape, its continents, its dimensions. And yet, we're told the builders believed the Earth was flat. Something doesn't align, and Egypt is just one example. In Peru, high in the Andes, lies Sacsayhuaman, a fortress built from enormous stone blocks, some weighing over 100 tons. These stones are not simply stacked. They are cut into complex, irregular shapes and fitted together with such precision that even a blade cannot slide between them. No mortar, no gaps, just perfect contact. The civilization credited with this, the Inca, did not use iron tools. They did not use the wheel. And when asked by the Spanish who built these walls, they gave a simple answer. The gods, or those who came before us. In Lebanon, at Baalbek, the foundation of an ancient temple rests on stones so massive they challenge modern engineering. 3 blocks, each weighing around 800 tons, form part of the base. Nearby, in a quarry, lies an even larger stone, over 1,000 tons, partially cut, but never moved, as if the work was suddenly abandoned, as if something interrupted it, as if whoever was building simply stopped. Across the world, Turkey, Egypt, Peru, Lebanon, and beyond, we find the same anomalies. Structures built with precision and scale that seem out of place in their supposed time. Cultures that inherit knowledge, but claim they did not create it. And always, the same story. They learned from someone else, from beings who came from above, who brought knowledge, who built, and then left. The Sumerians called them the Anunnaki, those who came from the sky. The Egyptians spoke of the Netjeru, divine rulers who governed before human kings. In South America, there was Viracocha. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl. Different names, same narrative. Teachers, visitors, departing figures. At this point, we face a choice. We can dismiss all of it as coincidence. Independent myths forming similar patterns by chance. Human imagination repeating itself across cultures. Or we can consider something far more unsettling. What if these stories are not inventions, but memories? Distorted over time, passed down through generations, altered, simplified, mythologized, but rooted in something real. A shared event, a shared origin, a shared departure. Because if a civilization existed before the one we know, and if it possessed knowledge far beyond what we expect for its time, then its disappearance becomes the most important question in human history. Not how it began, but why it ended. Or more precisely, why it left. To answer that, we have to stop looking only at what humanity built and start looking at the planet itself. Because around 12,800 years ago, something happened. Something sudden, something violent, something that changed everything. To understand why a civilization would leave Earth, we have to look beyond ruins, beyond myths, and into the memory of the planet itself. Because Earth remembers, not in words, not in stories, but in layers, in ice, in stone, in the silent records written over hundreds of thousands of years. Around 12,800 years ago, something happened that still confuses scientists today. The planet was warming. The last ice age was ending. Glaciers were retreating. Life was stabilizing. Conditions were improving. And then, suddenly, everything reversed. Temperatures dropped sharply across the northern hemisphere. Glaciers surged back. Ecosystems collapsed. Entire species vanished in what, geologically speaking, was almost an instant. This period is known as the Younger Dryas, and for decades, no one could fully explain it. Gradual climate shifts couldn't account for the speed. Solar variation didn't fit the data. The change was too abrupt, too extreme. Something external, something catastrophic, had to be involved. In 2007, a controversial hypothesis began to gain traction. A fragmented comet. Not a single impact, but a swarm. Multiple fragments entering Earth's atmosphere, striking across vast regions of the northern hemisphere. Each impact unleashing energy equivalent to millions of nuclear explosions. Evidence began to surface. Across North America, Europe, and parts of Asia, researchers found a thin layer in the geological record, dating precisely to that time. Within it, microscopic diamonds formed under extreme pressure, melted materials, traces of high-temperature events that could not be explained by ordinary processes. And then came one of the most striking discoveries. Beneath the ice of Greenland, hidden for thousands of years, lies a massive impact crater, over 30 kilometers wide. The Hiawatha crater, large enough to have been formed by an object the size of a city. Imagine it. A body kilometers wide, moving faster than any bullet ever fired, colliding with Earth. The force would vaporize ice instantly, send shock waves around the planet, inject massive amounts of dust and water vapor into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight, disrupting climate, triggering chaos. Now imagine, it wasn't the only one. Fires igniting across continents, tsunamis sweeping coastlines, earthquakes reshaping landscapes. Within days, weeks, perhaps months, the entire planet transformed. For a developing civilization, even an advanced one, this would not be a challenge. It would be an extinction-level event. And yet, here is where the story becomes more complex. Because when we return to Gobleki Tepe, we find something impossible to ignore. It was buried at almost exactly the same time. Not gradually, not by natural sedimentation, but intentionally, deliberately, as if someone made a decision to preserve it before the catastrophe struck. That implies awareness, preparation, knowledge of what was coming, and that changes everything. Because if they knew, then they had time. Time to decide. Time to act. Time to choose between staying or leaving. Now consider this. On one of the pillars at Gobleki Tepe, there are carvings that some researchers interpret as astronomical symbols, patterns that may correspond to constellations. One in particular, linked to the region of the sky from which such cometary debris could originate. It's not proof, but it is suggestive. A record, a warning, or perhaps a message left behind. And when you combine this with what we know about the oceans, the picture becomes even more unsettling. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose by over 120 meters. Vast coastal regions, where human settlements would most likely exist, were submerged. Entire landscapes gone. Cities, if they existed, now lie beneath water, hidden beneath sediments, lost to time. We have explored less than 5% of the ocean floor. Think about that. 95%, still unknown. If a civilization thrived along ancient coastlines, its remains could be right there, beneath us, untouched, unseen. Which raises a question that is difficult to ignore. What if we are not looking in the right places because the evidence is no longer on land? And what if the fragments we do find, massive stone structures built to endure time, were never meant to be the civilization itself, but only what it chose to leave behind? Because if you knew a global catastrophe was coming, and you had the means to escape it, would you stay? Or would you leave something behind for whoever came after? A message carved in stone, a signal across time, waiting to be understood. If a civilization knew a catastrophe was coming, and if it had the capability to act on that knowledge, then the question is no longer whether it survived. The question becomes, how? Because survival does not always mean staying. We tend to think in limited terms. Shelters, underground bunkers, migration, adaptation. These are the strategies we understand, the ones we would use. But what if they had options we don't? What if their understanding of physics, of energy, of space itself, was fundamentally different from ours? It sounds extreme, but consider this. Modern science already acknowledges that our understanding of the universe is incomplete. Dark matter, dark energy, quantum entanglement. Phenomena we can observe, but not fully explain. The deeper we look, the more we realize how much we don't know. Now, imagine a civilization that had thousands, or tens of thousands of years to explore these unknowns, to experiment, to refine, to discover methods of movement, not limited by distance in the way we understand it. Because if you could predict a global catastrophe, and you had the knowledge to leave, then leaving becomes not just possible, but logical. And suddenly, the ancient stories start to feel different. Not like myths, but like echoes. Across cultures, across continents, across time, we hear the same thing repeated again and again. They came from the sky. They taught. They built. And then, they left. The Sumerians described the Anunnaki as beings who descended from the heavens. They brought knowledge, agriculture, mathematics, astronomy. They shaped the early development of civilization. And then, they were gone. The Egyptians spoke of Zep Tepe, the first time, a period when divine beings ruled before human kings. They established order, knowledge, and structure. And then, that age ended. In South America, Viracocha arrived from the sea, taught humanity, and departed, promising to return. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl, described as a bearded figure, did the same. Different cultures, different continents, same sequence. Arrival, teaching, departure. This repetition is difficult to ignore, because independent invention usually creates variation. But this is consistency. And consistency suggests a shared origin, a shared memory, something that was experienced, then retold, then preserved. But there's another detail that appears just as often: conflict. Many of these traditions don't describe a single group of beings. They describe divisions, disagreements, wars. The Sumerian texts speak of conflicts among the Anunnaki themselves. Hindu epics describe battles between Deva and Asuras, gods and opposing forces, using weapons of immense destructive power. Greek mythology tells of wars between Titans and Olympians. Norse legends speak of gods locked in cycles of conflict that eventually lead to Ragnarok, a catastrophic end, followed by renewal. Different names, different symbols, same underlying idea. A powerful civilization, divided, which raises a possibility that is rarely considered. What if the departure was not unanimous? What if some chose to leave, and others chose to stay? Or worse, what if they didn't agree on what should happen to Earth and to us? Because if a catastrophe was approaching, and if there were different factions within this civilization, then their response would not be simple. Some might try to preserve knowledge. Some might try to control the outcome. Some might try to protect humanity. Others might not. And suddenly, the myths of divine conflict begin to look less symbolic and more like distorted records of real events. A civilization facing extinction, divided on how to respond, some leaving, some staying, some, perhaps, interfering. And if that's true, then humanity may not just be the Nasledi of a lost civilization. It may be the result of its final decisions. Which brings us to something even more unsettling. Because in nearly every tradition, the story does not end with departure. It ends with a promise. They will return. They will return. This idea appears so often, in so many cultures, that it stops feeling like coincidence. It becomes a pattern. In ancient Egypt, there was a belief that the age of the gods was not gone forever, only paused. That one day, the Netjeru would walk the earth again, restoring balance and order. In Mesoamerican traditions, Quetzalcoatl was not gone. He had departed and would come back from the east. In Sumerian texts, the gods did not vanish completely. They withdrew, watched, waited. Even in later religious systems, the same structure appears. A departure, a period of absence, and then a return. But why promise to return if the story was over? Why leave that thread unfinished? Unless it wasn't over at all. Because if a civilization left Earth in response to a predictable, cyclical catastrophe, then their timeline would not be the same as ours. They wouldn't measure time in centuries. They would measure it in cycles. Astronomical cycles, planetary shifts, long periods tied to the movement of the Earth through space. And here, we arrive at something ancient cultures seem to understand, but we often overlook. The idea that time itself moves in repeating patterns. The precession of the equinoxes, a slow wobble of Earth's axis that completes a full cycle roughly every 26,000 years. This movement changes the position of the stars over time, alters the sky itself. Ancient structures across the world appear aligned not just to the sun, but to specific stellar positions tied to this cycle. Gobleki Tepe, the pyramids, the Sphinx, all hint at a deep awareness of celestial mechanics. And if that awareness existed, then so does another possibility. That catastrophic events are not random, but periodic. That Earth, as it moves through space, encounters regions, debris fields, gravitational influences, cosmic hazards, at predictable intervals. And if a civilization had mapped these cycles, understood them, tracked them over thousands of years, then they would know exactly when the next danger was coming. Which means their departure may not have been escape. It may have been timing. Leaving before the event. Returning after the recovery. Not abandoning Earth, but stepping away from it. Temporarily. That would explain the myths. Why they always promise to come back. Why they leave knowledge behind. Why they preserve structures that can survive time. Because they expect someone to find them, to understand them, to be ready. And that leads to a question that is no longer about the past, but about us. If cycles exist, and if the last major catastrophe occurred around 12,800 years ago, where are we now in that cycle? Are we early? Are we safe? Or are we approaching something? Because modern science already confirms that Earth is not isolated. Asteroids pass close to our planet regularly. Cometary debris intersects our orbit. Near-Earth objects are tracked, but not all of them. Not all can be seen in time. And if a swarm event like the one hypothesized during the Younger Dryas were to occur again. Our current systems may not be enough. So imagine this: a civilization thousands of years more advanced than ours, aware of these cycles, able to predict them with precision, facing a choice: stay and risk extinction, or leave and return later. What would they choose? And more importantly, what would we choose? Because for the first time in human history, we are beginning to understand the same patterns. We are mapping the sky, tracking objects, studying climate shifts. We are, slowly, stepping into the same awareness, the same position, the same decision point, which means this story is no longer just about them. It's about us, and whether we are ready to see what they saw, to understand what they understood, and to face the possibility that the greatest mystery is not what happened 12,000 years ago, but what might happen next. If this is about cycles, then myths are no longer just stories. They are warnings, encoded, simplified, passed down through generations that no longer understood their original meaning, but preserved them anyway, because something about them felt important, necessary, worth remembering. And among all these myths, one stands above the rest: the flood. Not a local flood, not a river overflowing its banks, a global catastrophe. Water rising, lands disappearing, entire worlds lost beneath the surface. More than 500 cultures across the planet tell this story. Different names, different heroes, same event. In Mesopotamia, it was Ziusudra. In the Bible, Noah. In India, Manu. In Greece, Deucalion. In Mesoamerica, entire previous worlds destroyed by water. Separate civilizations, no contact, no shared language, yet the same memory. That alone should make us pause, because myths usually diverge. They evolve. They change with culture. But this one remains consistent. A great flood. A warning? A small group survives, and knowledge is preserved. Now connect this to what we know. At the end of the last ice age, massive glacial lakes formed, held back by walls of ice. When those natural dams failed, unimaginable volumes of water were released. One of the largest of these was Lake Agassiz. At its peak, it was larger than modern France. When it broke, the outflow would have been catastrophic. Not gradual, not slow. Violent. Unstoppable. Entire regions submerged in days, perhaps even hours. Coastlines erased. Settlements, if they existed, gone without a trace. And remember, sea levels rose by over 120 meters during this period. That's enough to drown entire continents' worth of coastal land. If a civilization existed near the oceans, and most do, then its primary centers would now be underwater. Not destroyed. Hidden. And we've barely looked. Less than 5% of the ocean floor has been properly explored. That means 95% of it remains unknown. Think about that. We know more about the surface of Mars than we do about the bottom of our own oceans. And yet, in the few places we have looked, we've already found anomalies. Near Japan, at Yonaguni, there are massive stone formations, terraces, steps, sharp angles that resemble constructed architecture. In the Gulf of Cambay, off the coast of India, sonar scans have revealed what appears to be the layout of an ancient city, now submerged. Off the coast of Egypt, entire cities, like Heracleion, have been found beneath the sea. These are just fragments, hints, accidents of discovery. What else is down there? How many cities? How many structures? How many answers? Now return to the central idea. A civilization exists. It understands astronomy. It tracks cycles. It predicts a catastrophic event. It knows that the oceans will rise, that the land will change, that survival on the surface will be uncertain. So it prepares. Some stay. They preserve knowledge. They encode warnings into myths. They build structures that can endure. They pass information forward, knowing it will be misunderstood, but hoping it will survive. Others leave. And this is where the idea becomes difficult. Because leaving Earth is not something we can easily imagine. But that limitation is ours, not necessarily theirs. Because even now, humanity is beginning to take its first steps beyond this planet. Satellites, space stations, missions to Mars, primitive, early attempts, but real. Now extend that trajectory forward, not by decades, but by thousands of years. What becomes possible? What technologies emerge? What understanding develops? If we are already moving in that direction, then why assume no one before us ever did? And if someone did, if a civilization reached that level, then leaving Earth would not be impossible. It would be inevitable. Not as an escape, but as a continuation. And that reframes everything. Because now, the structures they left behind are not ruins. They are markers. The myths are not fantasies. They are echoes. And the silence, the absence of this civilization, is not proof that it ended, but that it moved on. If they left, and if they intended to return, then one question remains suspended in the silence they left behind. When? Because everything we've explored so far, structures, geological events, myths, cycles, points to one unsettling idea. Timing matters, not just in the past, but in the future. Ancient cultures didn't just tell stories about the past. They built entire systems around time itself. Cycles within cycles, ages that rise, peak, collapse, and begin again. The Mayans tracked long-count calendars spanning thousands of years. The Hindus described vast repeating ages, yugas, that stretch across immense spans of time. Even in ancient Egypt, time was not linear. It was regenerative, eternal return. Different civilizations, same conclusion. History repeats. Not exactly, not identically, but rhythmically. And if that rhythm includes catastrophe, then it also includes recovery. Which means that a civilization advanced enough to recognize this pattern would not fear it. It would plan around it. It would step out of the cycle, and then step back in. Now consider this carefully. If the last major global disruption occurred around 12,800 years ago, and if such events are tied to long astronomical cycles, then we are no longer looking at random history. We are looking at a timeline, a sequence, a countdown, because cycles imply intervals, and intervals imply recurrence. This is not about predicting an exact date. That would be speculation. But the pattern itself is difficult to ignore. Earth moves through space, not in a straight line, but through regions, through environments, through invisible structures, gravitational fields, debris streams, cosmic pathways. And just like a planet can pass through a calm region, it can also pass through a dangerous one. If that happened once, it can happen again. Now imagine that you are part of a civilization that understands this perfectly. You have mapped the sky, tracked the movements, recorded the cycles across generations. You know not only that an event will occur, but when. Would you wait for it? Or would you leave and return after it passes? And if you chose to return, you would need something. A way to reconnect with the world you left behind. A signal, a reference point. Something that survives the catastrophe. Stone. Massive, durable, aligned to the stars. Structures that cannot be erased easily. Structures that outlive civilizations. Structures like Gobleki Tepe, the pyramids, the Sphinx. Not random monuments, but anchors, markers in time, coordinates, not just in space, but in cycles. Because if you leave and intend to return thousands of years later, you need a way to know when you've arrived at the right moment. And what better way than to encode that information into the very structure of the planet itself? Orientation to stars that shift over time. Alignments that only match at specific points in a long cycle. A system, not of words, but of geometry. Waiting for someone to notice, to understand, to realize that these are not just relics of the past, but instruments. And if that's true, then humanity has been living among them the entire time. Walking past them, studying them, measuring them, without asking the most important question. Not how they were built, but why they were built to last. Because if they were meant to endure, then they were meant to be found. And if they were meant to be found, then they were meant to be understood. Which leads us to something unavoidable. Because if we are now advanced enough to question these things, to notice the patterns, to connect the fragments, then perhaps we are approaching the point where the message was meant to be read. If the message was meant to be read, then the next question becomes unavoidable. Have we already begun to understand it without realizing? Because over the past century, something has changed, not just technologically, but cognitively. For most of human history, we accepted the world as it appeared. We built, we survived, we adapted. But only recently have we begun to question the deeper structure of reality itself. We've mapped the planet. We've split the atom. We've stepped beyond the atmosphere. We've started to look outward and backward at the same time. And in doing so, we've uncovered something strange. The more we learn, the more the past stops looking primitive and starts looking incomplete. Because the official narrative still insists on a steady, linear progression. But the evidence we've explored suggests something else. Disruption. Reset. Recovery. Not once, but possibly many times. Civilizations rising, reaching a peak, and then disappearing. Leaving behind only what could survive time. Stone. Symbols. Stories. And if that pattern is real, then our current civilization is not the first to reach this level. It's simply the latest. Which raises a possibility that is both unsettling and strangely logical. What if we are not discovering new knowledge, but rediscovering old knowledge? Fragments left behind, concepts re-emerging, ideas that feel new, but are actually echoes. Because think about it. Mathematics feels discovered, not invented. Physics reveals rules that already exist. Astronomy uncovers patterns that were always there. We are not creating the universe. We are learning how it works, the same way someone else might have, long before us. And if they did, then the knowledge we are slowly piecing together may already have been understood, mastered, used, which means their disappearance becomes even more significant. Because a civilization that reaches that level does not simply vanish. It either destroys itself or it moves beyond. And if they moved beyond, then their absence is not a mystery. It's a transition. Now consider this from a different angle. If they left Earth, and if they intended to return, then they would need to observe, to monitor, to know when the planet was stable again, to know when conditions were right, to know when we were ready. And that introduces a possibility that is difficult to prove, but equally difficult to dismiss, that we have never been alone, not in the way we think, not as isolated as we assume. Because observation does not require presence, it requires awareness, technology, perspective. And if a civilization is advanced enough to leave Earth, then observing it from a distance would be trivial, which leads to a quiet, almost unsettling thought. What if the silence we perceive is not emptiness, but distance? And what if the myths were not only about the past, but about continuity, about a connection that was never fully severed? Because in many traditions, the gods did not just promise to return. They promised to watch, to guide, to intervene when necessary. We've always interpreted that symbolically, religiously. But what if it was meant, literally? Not as divine beings, but as a civilization that once lived here, left, and never fully stopped paying attention. And if that's true, then everything changes. Because now, this is no longer just a story about ancient history. It becomes a story about presence, about awareness, about the possibility that humanity is not evolving in isolation, but under observation, slowly reaching a point where understanding becomes possible again. And if we are being observed, then the most important shift is not technological. It is perceptual, because for thousands of years, humanity has asked the same question. Are we alone? But perhaps that question was always incomplete. Perhaps the real question is different. Are we ready to understand that we were never alone to begin with? Because everything we've explored, structures, myths, geological evidence, cycles, points toward a single quiet conclusion. Not proof, but direction. A pattern that suggests continuity. Not an isolated beginning, not a random emergence, but a chapter in something much longer. And if that's true, then our current moment in time becomes extremely significant. Because we are reaching a threshold, not just of technology, but of awareness. For the first time, we are capable of seeing the bigger picture. We are mapping cosmic objects that could threaten Earth. We are decoding ancient structures with precision instruments. We are comparing myths across cultures and noticing their similarities. We are asking questions that previous generations didn't even know to ask. And that matters. Because if the message left behind was meant for a future civilization, then it had to wait for one capable of recognizing it, understanding it, interpreting it, not dismissing it. And maybe, That civilization is us. But here is where the story becomes more complex. Because understanding a message is one thing. Accepting its implications is something else entirely. Because if we accept the possibility that an advanced civilization existed before us, then we must also accept that our place in history is not unique, not final, not absolute. And if we accept that this civilization may have left Earth intentionally, then we must confront the idea that leaving is not the end of a civilization, but a stage of it, a transition, which means we may eventually face the same decision. Because think about where we are now. We are beginning to explore space seriously. Private companies launching rockets, plans for lunar bases, discussions about colonizing Mars. Early, fragile steps, but steps nonetheless. And every step we take away from Earth moves us closer to a point where staying here is no longer the only option. Now imagine that process extended over centuries, or millennia. At some point, leaving Earth would not be extraordinary. It would be expected, necessary, even inevitable. And if that's where we are heading, then perhaps we are not discovering a new path. We are following an old one that has already been taken. Which brings us back to the beginning, to the idea that started this journey. What if the first civilization didn't disappear, but departed? Not destroyed, but transitioned. Not lost, but simply no longer here? And if that's true, then the ruins we study are not just remnants of the past. They are signposts, markers left behind by those who already made the choice we are only beginning to consider. And if they made that choice, then they understood something important enough to leave everything behind, which raises the final, and perhaps most unsettling question. What did they know that we don't? What did they know that we don't? This question sits at the center of everything, because if a civilization reached a level of understanding beyond ours, if it mapped the sky, tracked cycles, predicted catastrophe, and ultimately chose to leave, then its decisions were not random. They were informed, calculated, necessary, which means there was something they understood about Earth, about space, about time itself, that changed the way they saw their future. And maybe that knowledge is not entirely lost. Maybe it was never meant to be, because throughout everything we've explored, one pattern keeps repeating. They didn't just leave. They left something behind. Not machines, not obvious technology, but something far more durable. Knowledge, encoded. Not in language that could be forgotten, but in structures, in alignments, in relationships between Earth and sky. Because language changes, civilizations fall, but mathematics, geometry, celestial motion, those remain constant. And if you wanted to send a message across thousands of years, that is what you would use. Now think about this carefully. Many ancient structures are aligned with stars, not as they appear today, but as they appeared thousands of years ago. Some alignments only make sense when you account for precession, the slow movement of Earth's axis over time, which means whoever built them understood not just the sky, but how the sky changes over millennia. That is not primitive knowledge. That is advanced. And if that knowledge was intentional, then those structures are not just symbolic. They are precise, timed, placed within a cycle, which leads to a possibility that is both simple and profound. That these structures are not just markers of where they were, but when they were, points in time, encoded in stone. And if that's true, then they may also point forward, not just backward, because a system that tracks cycles can predict them, and a civilization that understands cycles can prepare for them, which brings us back to the idea of departure, because leaving Earth only makes sense if staying becomes dangerous, not once, but repeatedly. If catastrophic events are part of a larger pattern, then any civilization that reaches a certain level of awareness will eventually face the same realization. That survival may require stepping outside the system, not permanently, but temporarily, waiting for the cycle to pass, returning when conditions stabilize. And if that's the case, then the concept of first civilization becomes misleading, because it may not have been the first, only the last one, before us. And we may not be the final one either, just the next. Now pause for a moment, because this is where the story changes direction. Up until now, we've been looking backward, at ruins, at myths, at geological scars, trying to reconstruct something that is no longer visible. But if everything we've explored is even partially true, then the past is not the most important part of this story. The future is, because if cycles exist, if knowledge can be preserved, if civilizations can rise, fall, and return, then we are not just observers of this pattern. We are participants, right now, at this point in time, living through a moment where awareness is increasing, where technology is accelerating, where we are beginning to look beyond Earth, not as a dream, but as a necessity. And that is exactly where this kind of story becomes real, because it stops being about what if, and starts becoming about what next. What happens next depends on what we choose to see. Because for most of history, humanity has lived inside a very narrow frame of understanding. We saw ourselves as the beginning, the center, the highest point of development. But slowly, that perspective is shifting. Not all at once, not dramatically, but quietly, steadily, through questions that refuse to go away. Why do ancient structures defy simple explanation? Why do myths repeat the same patterns across disconnected cultures? Why does the geological record point to sudden, catastrophic resets? And why does it feel as if something is missing? Not evidence, but context. As if we are looking at fragments without seeing the full picture they belong to. Because imagine reading a book where most of the pages are missing. You would still see characters, events, moments, but the story would feel incomplete, disconnected, confusing. That may be exactly where we are now, looking at the remains of something much larger, without realizing how much is gone. But here is the turning point. Because once you accept that possibility, you begin to see the present differently. Not as the peak of history, but as a phase. A stage within a repeating process. And that changes how you interpret everything around you. Technology is no longer just progress. It becomes acceleration. A rapid movement toward something, toward a threshold. And the question becomes, what happens when we reach it? Because if previous civilizations reached a similar point, then their next step was not just advancement, it was decision. Stay or leave. Remain within the cycle, or step beyond it. And that decision may not be philosophical, it may be practical, because Earth, as stable as it seems, is not constant. Its climate shifts, its poles move, its orbit carries it through changing regions of space. It is part of a system, not separate from it. Which means that long-term survival may not be guaranteed here. Not forever. And if a civilization understands that deeply enough, then expanding beyond Earth is not exploration. It is adaptation. A response. A solution. Now consider where we are today. We are beginning to think in those terms. Not openly, not universally, but the idea is there. Colonizing other planets. Building self-sustaining habitats. Creating systems that do not depend on Earth. These are no longer fantasies. They are plans. Early, imperfect, but real. And that suggests something important. We are approaching the same realization, the same awareness, the same point in the cycle. Which means we may be moving toward the same outcome. Not because history is repeating blindly, but because the conditions are similar. The knowledge is emerging, the options are becoming visible, and the question is forming, whether we want to ask it or not. Do we stay, or do we prepare to leave? And if that question was asked before, then somewhere, long ago, an answer was already chosen. And if an answer was already chosen, then we are no longer standing at the beginning of the question. We are standing in the middle of its consequences, because everything we've explored, the structures, the myths, the geological evidence, the cycles, they all point in one direction. Not toward a mystery, but toward a pattern, a sequence that repeats until it is understood. A civilization emerges. It grows. It learns. It reaches a point where it begins to understand the larger system it exists within. And then, it faces a decision. Not about survival in the short term, but about continuity. About what comes next. And what we often call disappearance may not be disappearance at all. It may simply be the moment when a civilization stops being earthbound. Now, imagine this from their perspective. They had time. They saw the signs. They understood the cycles. They knew something was coming, not as a surprise, but as a certainty. And they realized something we are only beginning to grasp, that no matter how advanced you become, if you remain within a fragile system, you remain vulnerable to it. So they adapted, not by building stronger walls, not by trying to resist the cycle, but by stepping outside of it. And before they left, they made a choice to leave something behind. Not everything. Not enough to rebuild their world instantly, but enough to guide, to hint, to provoke questions. Because knowledge, given too early, is ignored. But knowledge discovered changes everything. So they left fragments, structures that shouldn't exist, alignments that don't make sense at first glance, stories that sound like myths until you start comparing them. And over time, those fragments begin to connect. Slowly, subtly, until a new picture starts to emerge. Not imposed, but realized. And that is where we are now, at the edge of realization, beginning to see that history may not be a straight line, but a loop, that progress may not be unique, but recurring. and that we may not be the first to stand at this exact point. Looking up at the sky, asking the same questions. Now everything becomes quieter. Less about answers, more about awareness. Because the final truth of this idea is not something you prove. It's something you begin to feel. A shift in perspective. A recognition that something about the story of humanity has always been incomplete. And that maybe, just maybe, we are starting to fill in the missing parts. Not all at once. Not fully. But enough to change the way we see ourselves. Because if there was a civilization before us, and if it left, and if it intends to return, then the future is not empty. It is waiting. Waiting for a moment. A point in the cycle. A level of understanding. And maybe that moment is closer than we think. So, as you sit here now, in a world that feels modern, stable, familiar, consider this quietly. The stones are still here. The alignments are still precise. The myths are still being told. Nothing was erased. Nothing was lost completely. Only forgotten. And if something was forgotten, it can be remembered. Not by accident, but by reaching a point where remembering becomes possible. So the question is no longer, why did the first civilization leave Earth? The question is, will we recognize why, before we have to make the same choice? And maybe that's the part we've been missing all along. Not the evidence, not the structures, not even the myths, but the perspective required to connect them. Because nothing we've discussed is hidden. Gobleki Tepe still stands. The pyramids are still there. The Sphinx still faces the horizon. Exactly as it always has. The stories have never stopped being told. They've been right in front of us. The only thing that changed is our ability to look at them differently. To stop asking isolated questions and start asking connected ones. Not, how was this built? But why was it built this way? Not, why do cultures have myths? But why do they all share the same core memory? Not, what happened in the past? But what does it mean for the future? Because once you begin asking those questions, the entire narrative shifts from archaeology to intention, from history to message. And that message, if it exists, is subtle. It doesn't tell you what to think. It doesn't force conclusions. It simply points to patterns, to alignments, to repetitions, and leaves the final step to you. Because understanding cannot be given, only reached. And maybe that was always the idea, to leave just enough behind, that only a civilization at a certain level would begin to notice. Not earlier, not later, but at the exact moment when it becomes relevant. Now think about that. Out of the entire span of human existence, why now? Why are these questions becoming more common? Why are more people starting to notice inconsistencies, patterns, connections? Why does it feel like we are approaching something, even if we can't define what it is? Because awareness doesn't happen randomly. It builds, slowly, until it reaches a threshold. And once it crosses that threshold, it doesn't go back. Which means that whatever this pattern is, whatever this cycle represents, we are no longer at the beginning of it. We are somewhere closer to the turning point. And turning points always come with decisions. Because awareness changes responsibility. Once you see something, you cannot unsee it. Once you understand a pattern, you cannot pretend it isn't there. And if the pattern suggests that civilizations face a moment where they must choose, then recognizing that moment matters. Not in a dramatic way, not suddenly, but quietly, internally, as a shift from passive existence to conscious direction. Because maybe the real reason this idea feels so compelling is not because it explains the past, but because it hints at something ahead, something we are moving toward, whether we realize it or not. And if that's true, then the story of the first civilization leaving Earth is not just history. It's a mirror, showing us a possible version of our own future. Not identical, not predetermined, but similar enough that we can learn from it, if we choose to. So now, everything becomes simpler. Not easier, but clearer. Because the final question is no longer hidden in ancient stones or forgotten myths. It's right here, in the present moment, in the direction we are moving, in the awareness we are gaining. Because if they once stood where we stand now, looking at the same sky, recognizing the same patterns, facing the same unknown, then their story is not separate from ours. It's connected, and maybe continuing. So as this journey comes to a close, there is nothing left to prove, nothing left to confirm, only something to consider, quietly, without urgency, without conclusion, just a thought that stays with you. What if the first civilization didn't leave Earth to escape the end, but to continue somewhere else? And if that's true, then maybe the question is not whether they will return, but whether we will reach the point where we understand why they left in the first place. And maybe that's the part we've been missing all along. Not the evidence, not the structures, not even the myths, but the perspective required to connect them, because nothing we've discussed is hidden. Gobleki Tepe still stands. The pyramids are still there. The Sphinx still faces the horizon, exactly as it always has. The stories have never stopped being told. They've been right in front of us. The only thing that changed is our ability to look at them differently, to stop asking isolated questions and start asking connected ones. Not, how was this built? But why was it built this way? Not, why do cultures have myths? But why do they all share the same core memory? Not, what happened in the past? But what does it mean for the future? Because once you begin asking those questions, the entire narrative shifts, from archaeology to intention, from history to message. And that message, if it exists, is subtle. It doesn't tell you what to think. It doesn't force conclusions. It simply points to patterns, to alignments, to repetitions, and leaves the final step to you. Because understanding cannot be given, only reached. And maybe that was always the idea, to leave just enough behind that only a civilization at a certain level would begin to notice. Not earlier, not later, but at the exact moment when it becomes relevant. Now think about that. Out of the entire span of human existence, why now? Why are these questions becoming more common? Why are more people starting to notice inconsistencies, patterns, connections? Why does it feel like we are approaching something, even if we can't define what it is? Because awareness doesn't happen randomly. It builds, slowly, until it reaches a threshold And once it crosses that threshold, it doesn't go back. Which means that whatever this pattern is, whatever this cycle represents, we are no longer at the beginning of it. We are somewhere closer to the turning point. And turning points always come with decisions. Because awareness changes responsibility. Once you see something, you cannot unsee it. Once you understand a pattern, you cannot pretend it isn't there. And if the pattern suggests that civilizations face a moment where they must choose, then recognizing that moment matters. Not in a dramatic way, not suddenly, but quietly, internally, as a shift from passive existence to conscious direction. Because maybe the real reason this idea feels so compelling is not because it explains the past, but because it hints at something ahead, something we are moving toward, whether we realize it or not. And if that's true, then the story of the first civilization leaving Earth is not just history. It's a mirror, showing us a possible version of our own future, not identical, not predetermined, but similar enough that we can learn from it, if we choose to. So now, everything becomes simpler, not easier, but clearer. Because the final question is no longer hidden in ancient stones or forgotten myths. It's right here, in the present moment, in the direction we are moving, in the awareness we are gaining. Because if they once stood where we stand now, looking at the same sky, recognizing the same patterns, facing the same unknown, then their story is not separate from ours. It's connected, and maybe continuing. So, as this journey comes to a close, there is nothing left to prove, nothing left to confirm, only something to consider, quietly, without urgency, without conclusion. Just a thought that stays with you. What if the first civilization didn't leave Earth to escape the end, but to continue somewhere else? And if that's true, then maybe the question is not whether they will return, but whether we will reach the point where we understand why they left in the first place. And maybe there is one last layer to all of this, one that is quieter than everything else, not in the stones, not in the sky, but in us. Because throughout this entire journey, there has been an underlying assumption that we are separate from whatever came before, that we are the observers, the ones trying to understand something external. But what if that separation isn't real? Because if a civilization existed before us, and if it possessed knowledge far beyond what we expect, and if it chose not to destroy the world, but to preserve something, then we have to ask a different kind of question. Not, what did they leave behind? But what did they carry forward? Because structures can be left, knowledge can be encoded, but continuity, that requires something else. Something that survives not in stone, but in living form. Now think about this carefully. Human beings appeared around 300,000 years ago. For most of that time, there is very little evidence of advanced development. Then, suddenly, within a relatively short period, we see an explosion. Agriculture, cities, writing, astronomy, mathematics. It's as if something accelerated, not gradually, but abruptly. And we explain that as progress, as natural development. But what if there's another way to look at it? What if it wasn't just development, but inheritance? Not in a direct, obvious way, not as clear memory, but as fragments, instincts, curiosity, a tendency to look up, to measure, to build, to understand patterns. Because if knowledge was preserved, it may not have been preserved only in structures. It may have been preserved in us, not as answers, but as questions. Because questions drive discovery. Questions lead to the same places. Again, and again, and again. Until something is remembered. And maybe that's why this idea feels familiar. Not because it's proven, but because it resonates. As if somewhere, just beyond conscious thought, there is recognition. A sense that this is not entirely new. That something about this path has been walked before. And if that's true, then the story of the first civilization does not end with departure. It continues through us, through every attempt to understand the universe, through every structure we build, through every question we ask. Because maybe we are not just studying their remnants, we are continuing their trajectory, reaching the same thresholds, facing the same decisions. Slowly, inevitably, moving toward the same realization. That existence on a single planet is temporary. That awareness expands. That boundaries shift. And that at some point, staying becomes a choice, not a limitation. So now, the entire narrative comes full circle. The ancient structures, the myths, the cycles, the catastrophes, the departure, the promise to return. None of it stands alone. It's all part of a single, continuous process, one that doesn't belong to the past or the future, but exists across both. And in that process, we are not outsiders. We are participants, right now, in this moment, at this stage, quietly approaching a point that others may have reached long before us. And as everything settles, as the questions slow down, there is only one final thought to leave with. Not an answer, not a conclusion, just something to sit with. If the first civilization didn't disappear, if it didn't fail, if it didn't end, but simply moved forward, then maybe the real question was never about them at all. Maybe it was always about us, and whether we are beginning to do the same. And when you look at it that way, something changes. The urgency disappears. The fear fades. Because this is no longer a story about loss. It's a story about transition, about movement, about continuity that doesn't rely on a single place or a single moment in time. Because for something to truly end, it has to stop completely. And nothing we've explored suggests that. Not the structures, not the myths, not the patterns. Everything points instead to something ongoing. Something that doesn't break, but shifts. Like a current moving beneath the surface. Invisible, but always there. And maybe that's why the answers never feel final. Why every explanation leads to another question. Why every discovery opens something deeper. Because we are not uncovering something finished. We are interacting with something still unfolding. Now imagine that. Not a lost civilization, but a continuous one. Not bound to a single era, but existing across many. Appearing, disappearing, returning, not as a cycle of destruction, but as a cycle of movement. And within that movement, each phase looks separate, disconnected, but from a wider perspective, it's all one process. One trajectory, and we are inside it. Right now. Not at the beginning, not at the end, but somewhere in between. Which means that whatever comes next is not unknown in the way we think. It has happened before, in some form, under different conditions, with different people, but along the same path. And that realization is quiet. It doesn't demand belief. It doesn't require proof. It simply sits there as a possibility, a way of seeing things differently. Because maybe the reason these ideas keep appearing, across cultures, across time, is not because they were imagined, but because they were remembered. Not clearly, not completely, but enough to leave an impression, enough to echo forward, enough to reach us. And now that they have, the responsibility shifts, not to accept, not to reject, but to observe, to pay attention, to notice patterns without rushing to conclusions. Because understanding something this large doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly, piece by piece, moment by moment, until one day it stops feeling like a theory and starts feeling like context. And when that happens, the question changes for the last time. Not, did they leave? Not, will they return? But something far more personal, something much closer, something that no longer belongs to history, but to you. Because if this path exists, if this trajectory is real, then every civilization that reaches a certain point begins to face the same realization, that it is not separate from the universe, but part of its movement. And once that realization settles in, there is only one direction left. Forward. Not as escape, not as abandonment, but as continuation. So maybe the first civilization didn't leave Earth behind. Maybe it simply moved beyond it. And maybe, quietly, slowly, without even fully realizing it yet, we are beginning to do the same.